hello everybody and welcome back to the 20 Years of Women on Boards podcast with me, Claire Braund, the co-founder and CEO of WOB. Today we're talking to Andrea Staines OAM, a full-time non-executive director for nearly 2 decades on a range of mostly Australian entities in transport, infrastructure and retail service. A country girl who grew up in the South Burnett region of Queensland, Andrea became the CEO of a major Australian company in her 30s, then stepped away in her early 40s to pursue directorships. She's now considered a trailblazer for those recognising non-executive directorship as a professional full-time career. In 2019, Andrea was awarded a Medal of the Order of Australia, OAM, for her efforts as a role model and mentor for women. Hello and welcome, Andrea.
Thank you, Claire. Delighted to be here.
Andrea, you grew up and went to school in Nanango in the South Burnett region in Queensland before winning a full scholarship to complete your high school education at the United World College in Singapore. From Nanango to Singapore in year 11 is a pretty big life change. How did you cope? How did it change your life and the choices that you made?
Yes, surprisingly, Claire, I think for most, including myself, I coped very well. So I went from a small school, small town, to a large international school in a large city, Singapore, and I absolutely loved it. I guess I blossomed with all the opportunities, the academic opportunities and other opportunities that the school made possible. And I also looked around me at all the students making very interesting decisions about what they were going to study and where they were going to study and to follow their passions. And so for me, in the old days, the school counsellor would have said, you're bright, you should do medicine or law. That's exactly what they did say to me. And I was going to do medicine because I was a math science student. Instead, I ultimately, through engineering, economics and an MBA, finally found my way to finance, my mathematical niche. And so Singapore changed my life completely and utterly.
You went on to complete an economics degree at the University of Queensland, leaning in, of course, to your mathematics, after which you went on to an MBA at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. How did your time in America shape your view of the world and Australia?
I think there's a couple of answers to this. One, at an individual level, I spent my 20s working in the United States, mostly for American Airlines. And so I think I learned to be quite a confident young person. And I brought that home when I came back to Australia some years later to work at Qantas. I managed upwards, for example, which wasn't the done thing, especially in Qantas, which was only a few years out of government ownership. From a macroeconomic perspective, what I felt in America was that very few people can have much effect on the future of the country in America. What I really have loved about returning to Australia and working in Australia both at the executive and NED level is that even a country girl from Nanango can make a contribution at the national level. I can be involved in the national debate with the right experience and the right attitude, the right network. You can be involved in the national debate, and including one of the areas I work on is infrastructure, and mostly infrastructure is conducted at the national level. And so I feel that I can make a difference. And I say to people, we need to take advantage of being small. Australia punches above its weight generally in several fields around the world, accounting, standards, measurement, things like that, and more. We need to recognise that that we are taking advantage of being small structurally. And one of the advantages is that you can have all the right people in the one marquee for the discussion about a particular topic. And so Australia is of this optimal size to look after its people, look after its economy. America doesn't work like that.
You forged a career in aviation after taking a role with American Airlines in Fort Worth, Dallas. Can you tell us about the time and what interested you in working in airlines, which I also understand you're about to come back to?
Yes. Starting with the executive work, I determined that I wanted to work in commercial finance, so not, say, in investment banking or commercial banking or professional services. I wanted to work in finance in corporations, and then I looked around, interviewed with a range of companies, and my number one choice was American Airlines, because I guess I've always loved airplanes, airlines, travel, and so I was a natural fit. And I never regret that decision for a moment to work in the airline industry, because Singapore started me traveling, the international experience at the school, and I haven't stopped since. We travel extensively, independently. So that was how I got into aviation, and then after a couple of years of few years of maternity leave, when I returned with my two children, solo and divorced, to Australia, I decided to move to Sydney and ask Qantas for a job, which they gave me, and as a manager to begin with, and then I worked my way up through Qantas.
As you said, you did turn to Australia. You took the role with Qantas. You had two young children in tow. You became obviously the CEO of the subsidiary of Australian Airlines, which was the forerunner to Jetstar. You were just 38 and you were the sole parent of two young children at the time. How did you manage?
I was extremely organised. I invested in myself, and you've heard me talk about investing in yourself in various ways as a female businesswoman. I invested in myself in that I had a nanny, not a live-in nanny, but a nanny who would come in the morning and leave in the evening. So my children weren't being, didn't have to do what I had to do, get up early and get dressed early and all of that. Probably the other blessing, to be honest, was that smartphones hadn't been invented at that point. So conversations at work were very crisp. You worked through everything you needed to do during the workday. So in that way, it was a blessing. Occasionally, I had to work at home, and occasionally I stayed late and had the children looked after. But generally speaking, I was able to compartmentalise my life probably more than people can do today.
Your parents were, of course, justifiably proud, as I'm sure other members of your family were as well. And as you know, I recall shortly after we launched Women on Boards in 2006, and I was doing a radio interview, and out there in South Burnett, your father was listening, and he rang me. I was quite surprised to get this call, and he was bursting with pride to tell me all about you and how you would be a fantastic board member. How important is the unwavering support of your parents throughout your life to your success?
Very important would be the summary. I was the first person in my family to go to university. My brother followed soon after, but when I think through, for example, I have 11 cousins, only one of those went to university. So I was just at the tail end of that generation where going to university was a struggle. I was very lucky. Gough Whitlam made it free, so I was able to go. My mum and dad, I am sure, talking of support, would have scraped together or taken out a personal loan, I'm sure, to put me through university if necessary. So definitely, they were already talking to me about university when I was in grade 3. So I think they were building that expectation and aspiration that might not have been seen around me in a small country town. They were building it within the family, and for my brother and me. And so that would be the first contribution, is that expectation that you would go on and do at least one university degree. And then onwards after that, always proud, always supportive in my case, with the children when I needed them to be. So we lived in 2 states, but occasionally being with an airline, I was able to take the 2 children, fly them up to Queensland. My parents would meet me and take them home for the school holidays while I continued to work, because, of course, I had 4 weeks leave a year and the children had 12. So the support comes in many different ways. Other people have support when they're developing executive and NED roles from their partner, their husband, which I've heard on your podcast already. I didn't have that at the time. I mean, I met someone wonderful about 10 years later, and we've been together since. So that has been very important as well. So I do think that having support in various ways does help your career development. For different women, it's different people and different styles of support. But yes, parental support, setting the expectation at the tail end of a generation that didn't expect to do what I did was really important. And your younger listeners will find it hard to identify with unless they've had a story from their mother, as I did, or from their grandmother, as I did, that explains this. For example, families treating sons and daughters differently, sending sons to boarding school and university and having daughters finish at year 10. I lived with that around me. So in my case, it was particularly important being in a small country town.
Yeah, but it is interesting. You are not the first person on this podcast to talk about the impact that having the Gough Whitlam, the free education that came in through the university sector, the impact that it had on their lives and the fact that they were able to go on to university degrees when many of them wouldn't have been able to. And you are right, it's of this generation that we have been able to take advantage of that. You were one of the very first women to see directorship as a professional career choice rather than as something you did when you retired from professional life or as a side hustle. Unlike many people who move into boards, yours was a very planned, strategic activity. I think everything you do probably is like that. You're a very planned and strategic person. Can you step us through the decisions you made about building your board career, the roles you took and why?
It was a strategic move, but it happened in a short time period. It became obvious that I needed to suggest to my boss, Jeff Dixon, the head of Qantas Group, that we roll Australian Airlines on, that it be closed down and effectively become Jetstar in the simplest terms. I was still a solo parent. My children were approaching high school. And to be honest, I became a full-time board director because I realised that I didn't know how my daughter was going in maths. I remember the crystal clear moment where I decided that I was going to pursue and work really hard. I'd have to work hard to make board work my full-time career because it gave me the personal flexibility I needed to be around more for my children. So until that point, probably I had been the income provider and several nannies, wonderful nannies, had been the daily administrators. So I hadn't been as involved, and I needed to be able to do both. I needed to be the income provider and the home administrator. And to do that, I needed a flexible business role. Back then, part-time finance was not an option. Part-time professional services was starting to offer part-time work. But really, my only choice, I decided, or the choice that fitted me best, was to become a board director. Fortunately, I made that decision quite quickly, so I didn't have those 1 or 2 years of ramping up, but I did have a nice package when I left Qantas. So I recognised that as my opportunity to ramp up into a full-time board portfolio after a couple of years. How did I go about it? Yes, I had a very good friend who's in recruiting who said to me, you need to understand your strategic value. And so I took the classic Michael Porter book off the shelf and looked at understanding the companies I'd worked for, the industry, mostly airlines I'd worked for, with respect to a strategic definition defined by Michael Porter. And from there, I was able to effectively sell myself into related fields. And the two related fields were transport and infrastructure from airlines and retail service, which wasn't as obvious when I started out and wasn't as obvious to most people. I had to explain that one. But I realised I needed in the village of Australia that we discussed earlier, that is a smaller country than most, I needed to have more than one sphere I worked in because overlaps would prevent too many board roles. So I decided to have two spheres that were quite different but were both related to running an airline. And from there, I was able to interview successfully, I would say, by being able to explain the potential value I could add to the board roles. One thing I have heard others say also is that, begin with your local not-for-profits. I don't agree with that. I think you give back to your local not-for-profits in your later years when you're an experienced director because, frankly, that's what they need. So government-owned corporations, New South Wales, they call it state-owned corporations. I think federally they call it GBEs, government business enterprises. They were good targets because they actually are very good at compliance and strategy and to some extent risk management because ultimately their shareholders are ministers who don't want to be on the front page of the papers. And so you learn a lot from government-owned corporations, and you usually mix with very experienced directors. And so that was a really good space for me to begin with. And then I built into unlisted private companies and listed companies. I like the diversity. So I always made sure I had sort of one government, one private, one listed, so that I could see the Australian world, especially from different angles.
I think it's a really interesting point. If I recall rightly, I think your first board was Gladstone Ports. And then I think you went on to a very large hospital board, and you always told this wonderful story. In fact, you were talking at a WOB function about how an airline is really like a hospital. And so you were building those industry connections, highly unionised workforce, a lot of complexity, a lot of WHS.
Retail, yes. And so one other thing I decided early on was I'd come from airlines, including running revenue management, which is the seat inventory management and pricing. And so I have always stayed in service industry. So I understand expiring inventory that you have to sell today, you can't sell it tomorrow, be it a hospital bed or a Gladstone Port ship departure or an airline seat. So I actually decline interviewing for goods companies. I don't understand the goods companies. And so there are others. I may well be able to learn it, but I know now, especially with the work WOB's done and others have done, that there are enough experienced women out there who will also have the industry experience who can do that role well. So I focus on service industries.
Your first listed role, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it came from, and I always pronounce this wrong, Horizon, when it was a government board and then it listed, correct?
Yes, it wasn't quite my first, but it was my first large and first ASX 200. Queensland government privatised the freight side of Queensland Rail, and they called it QR National, and ultimately when it was listed, after some time we changed its name to Horizon to get that national orientation of the AU. I was the only 40-year-old, the only female and the only Queenslander on the board. And I chaired the Rail Network Committee, which interfaced with Economics Queensland, the state monopoly regulator, because of my economics background. I enjoyed chairing the committee, and I have chaired many committees, mostly by choice. And for some years I chaired audit and risk committees, because chairing audit and risk committees is a skill that you have. It's very useful. It can get you board roles. And then I shifted across deliberately into chairing people committees and I don't call them remuneration committees. I call them people committees. And I founded quite a few of those and expanded quite a few of those. And so committee chairmanship has been the sort of added layer that I've added to being a director, and I really enjoy it. You have influence, you have especially in the area you're chairing, and you have probably an extra inside line to the chair to have discussions offline about things you'd like to see developed, and it usually involves mentoring the head of HR, often a female these days, so that's another benefit. I have chosen not to progress to chair roles. And so I enjoy the chairmanship of committees. The reason I've chosen not to progress to chair roles, if you don't mind me adding, Claire, is that for me, one of the things I love about board work is the diversity. And when you take on chairmanships, you have to narrow your portfolio. You have to have less boards because of the workload involved. Generally speaking, an Australian Shareholders Association would tell you that one chairmanship is worth 3 directorships, even if you considered it to be worth 2 directorships. A full-time portfolio, I believe, is about 5 directorships. So you have to come down to at least 4, maybe 3. And I like the diversity. So chairing the committees lets me maintain a full portfolio of very diverse companies, industries, geographical locations, ownership structures, and still have that extra layer of participation.
I understand you've taken a bit of a sabbatical, a gap year, for want of a better word, and you're back to one board at the moment, and you've been focusing on your Spanish. So explain what drove that and where you're pivoting to now.
Yes, well, part of it was that I reached the age of 60 18 months ago, and I think we try to reflect whenever you have a 0th birthday. And so at the age of 60 came with almost 20 years in board work. I sat down and said, what am I going to do for my last decade of board work? And what I decided to do was to go half-time, let's call it part-time, and go back to my first love of aviation. So I started on Sunshine Coast Airport Board, and I've had a couple of where I've run close, and I've got a couple of potentials that are warm. And aviation doesn't just have to be airports or airlines. There's sustainable aviation fuel, there's drones, there's Air Services Australia and CASA. So it's not limited to airlines, which is my absolute love. Aeroplanes and tarmacs and things. I go and watch aeroplanes on occasion, but it is about going back to my first love. And it was a little bit about the need to refresh, to reinvigorate. I had seen a lot of things go around in 20 years, and I thought, how do I reinvigorate my attitude towards board work for this last decade? And I consider 70 to be about right to finish. And it was to say, I'm going back to my first love. I'm going to be true to myself and tell the recruiters that's what I'm interested in. And then the other half of my week is now my second love, which is Spanish. So my goal is to be bilingual. I could almost work in it now, probably. So that's sort of a bucket list goal. And if I want to achieve it, I need to create space for it. One of the things I say to people is that don't do board, you might have heard this, Claire, I'm sure, don't do board work for the money. If you want the money, stay as an executive. Board work allows you to have what I call professional diversity, we heard that before, and personal flexibility. And the flexibility is not only in its flexibility, but it's also potentially a little more time that you can create. And you have to create value out of that time. If you don't create value out of the time, you probably will feel underpaid as a board director. So in my case, it has been a lot of extra. I was traveling a lot with board work, and I would add on a night on my own independently and go to galleries and museums and exhibitions and musicals and so forth. Now I'm adding Spanish. So I think you have to see even full-time board work as a package beyond the work, and what can you wrap around it, because it gives you that flexibility.
You've talked about landing board roles. You just mentioned that you've been in the mix for a number. Some are warm, some are hot. So landing board roles can take a year. It can take 2 years. And a full NED portfolio, which you've mentioned is really sort of 4 or 5 boards, enables you really need to be looking for new roles almost every single year. So what practical advice do you give to women who are trying to build their board pipeline?
Yes, I think the first thing is, set a realistic expectation, which is that it takes a long time to build a full-time portfolio. So if you can do better than I and wrap it up with some executive work, that's probably advisable, or advisory work. If you consider that a full-time portfolio is 5, and there'll be reasons you roll off boards related to you and related to takeovers and so forth, you might only stay on boards on average 5 years. And so the mathematics tells you that you'll be adding a new board every year on average. And so that means the practical advice is you need to be perpetually looking and listening, and perpetually updating your internet profile in whatever space and place that is, and there's lots of them. And you can't let anything go old and stale, be it your knowledge, your profile, your network. It is consistent. It is like you are a business, and if you were a consultant, you would think quite cognitively about doing business development. Well, effectively, you are a consultant. You're a board director, and you have to think cognitively about doing business development of yourself. And that, as people who've done advisory and consulting work know, it never stops. So you have to make space for that in amongst those 5 boards and your visits to the National Gallery. And I have to say, for aspiring board directors, those who are saying, I'd like to talk to you about moving into board work or accelerating my growth in board work, the absolute number one thing I tell people is you must join Women on Boards. Do that and then come back to me once you've absorbed what they provide, and we can have another discussion about where you want to go. But that second conversation actually is then much more shaped by the work they've done on themselves and their self-awareness and their CV and all of the and their awareness of the industry, the Australian market or the New Zealand market, through your programs. And so then I'm able to help them because they are much more structured in their approach through the WOB training ground.
Thank you. You have been a WOB member for very many years, a very loyal member, and thank you for that. And that time your board career has just, taken off totally. Can you comment on the impact that WOB has had on you personally in terms of your board journey and how you describe the WOB community?
Yes, personally, as you know, when I joined, I think it was about April 2006 when you started up and you were doing the rounds, including of Qantas. And personally, the fact that it was a lot smaller then meant that you and Ruth were around a lot, and you were both of you were incredibly supportive of all of us who were joining and aspiring and pushing through and trying to develop board careers despite the challenges of the time. That probably still exist in many cases. The other thing was the practicality. I was always so thoroughly impressed by the practicality of what you offer and offered, be it how to write a CV. You were also ahead on the technology side of things. And the other thing I used to love, or I probably still love, Claire, is how quickly you as a previous journalist can write an article and how incisive those articles are. And I think WOB and all of us benefited from your advocacy through journalism. So hopefully you still got time to do some of that. I'm not sure, but you are very well suited to it, and we still need you to. The community I would describe as young and energetic. Sometimes people join their industry association because it's the right thing to do, but women who join WOB are joining because they want to make progress in their board career. And so whenever you go to a WOB function, it's cathartic, it's energetic, it's inspiring, it's motivating. And so even as a speaker, which I've done for you, I probably should do some more for you, I'm sorry, but it's the energy that's at the events that I find the WOB community brings. It's different from association events.
Thank you. As the number of women on boards continues to grow across all sectors, which really it is growing particularly fast, everything other than the ASX sort of 300 plus, we're entering our next decade. Diversity has changed its face. And what do you think is the next frontier?
I've heard a few answers to this question, and I'm going to come with an answer you probably don't expect. First of all, I think we need to understand the ASX 300 plus better. And we know that there's a lot of smaller entities, family entities, family and friends, and it is a bit of a challenge. But I think research in that space, I think, is the very next frontier. The answer that you may not expect is I think we actually need to look to understand, again, research to start with, the decision-making entities better, their percentage of women, frankly. The government's probably doing well. We know the boards are making some decisions, but for example, private equity owners, they place people on boards for their institutional infrastructure investments, for example. And so I think there's some space for us to really influence the decision makers of the board placements, and perhaps that it's sort of like a secondary route to getting more women on boards. And I'm staying with the women focus here. That's the other thing I still think we haven't broken down is that there is data out there that shows that the majority of males in significant positions in Australia, be it government, private, public, academic, have come from private schools, and the majority of them have come from private boys' schools. And you've heard me talk about this before. I just have to wonder what it says to those 6-year-olds or 12-year-olds when the majority of their teachers or of their administration and supervision and management and leadership at those schools is male. It's a subliminal hurdle we have to get over when they become decision makers. So I still remain concerned about the lack of female role models in private boys' schools. I have done some, desktop research of the number of female principals at male schools. You only need one hand. And I have done the research of the number of even male principals at female school, at girls' schools. And of course, there's many more of those. And so we still have a societal bias against females as school administrators, and particularly in boys' schools. And so that for me is kind of like going back to the societal structure. What do we need to change with boys? Not, even though we often are, we have had to focus on changing men.
No, it's a totally controversial one, and it's interesting because I picked it up on the back of my Churchill Fellowship. Of course, in Norway, they only have co-ed schools, and so you generally don't have this male and female split either, and a lot of Northern European countries are quite bemused by this sort of like slightly archaic British sort of system. And so it is interesting, and it would be very interesting to do some comparable research on that as well in terms of how those co-ed schools work too, because I know there's arguments on both sides. So yeah, it's an interesting one. Finally, Andrea, what are 3 words you would use to sum up your journey over the past 20 years?
Well, it won't surprise you that I wanted to give you 4. I've already given you 2, which is diversity and flexibility, the professional diversity, the personal flexibility. The other 2 I've added are camaraderie, because you work in a team environment, which I love, and finally learning. It's forced lifelong learning, and being curious and wanting to learn makes a better board director.
Andrea Staines, thank you very much for joining me on the podcast.
You're welcome. Thanks, Claire.